welcome back to Ship, Sea and the Stars from Royal Museums Greenwich. We've been away for a few weeks, but we're very excited to be back for a new series of these webcasts. And in the last series, we covered so many things. There were mermaids and isolation and deep sea crabs and roller skating captains, and still we've barely touched the surface of what is in the museum's collections and the expertise that its curators have to offer. So of course we're back for more, and we've got loads more of these stories, history and culture, sea, space and creativity, all of that rolled into one webcast over the next few weeks. And we have lots of curators and lots of expertise to share with you all. If there's a question that you'd like us to answer or a topic you'd like us to discuss, please let us know. We'd love to hear from you. You can do that by searching for Royal Museums Greenwich on Facebook, Instagram or Twitter. So please do that. We really do appreciate you getting in contact. Now, today's topic is the Cutty Sark. It is the iconic object, if you like, on the banks of the Thames at Greenwich. It's the very obvious thing. If you arrive at Greenwich by sea, you can't miss it. She's lifted up out of dry dock now. She's kind of floating on a sea of glass. And the really exciting thing is that after all of the museum sites being closed for so long, the Cutty Sark is going to be the first one to reopen on the 20th of July. And so we thought that this was a great opportunity to actually look at the ship, because everyone at the museum talks about it as though it's this really well-known family friend, but not everyone else knows that. So we want to dig into the story of the ship, why it's so special, and also use that to look at the future, because Cutty Sark is part of the age of sail, and we assume that is something from the past, but actually sail-powered, wind-powered vessels may have a future as well. And so we'll be talking about that in addition. And to help us dig into all of these topics, we have two curators from the museum. We have Louise McFarlane, who's the curator of Cutty Sark, and we have Laura Boone, who's the Lord Register Foundation Public Curator of Contemporary Maritime. So Louise, let's start with you. Obviously, you're the curator of the Cutty Sark, which is a very cool job title. Just tell us a little bit about how you see the ship and, what's your relationship with it?
Well, I've been curator of Cutty Sark for the last 4 years, and so I've sort of developed my relationship over that time. And I think the thing that always strikes me about the ship is that new things can always be discovered, particularly about the crew. There are so many stories to uncover about the crew that we're still trying to discover as we go on. So I just think it's a gift that keeps on giving, really. Cutty Sark has got so many stories to tell.
Fabulous. And Laura, how about you?
So as a contemporary curator, my interest in the Cutty Sark is a little bit different. I'm really interested in the impact and the potential that sail technology can have for shipping today.
Brilliant. Well, we're going to start with an account of life on board the Cutty Sark. It's written by a young apprentice, that was Clarence Ray. He was just 16, and this was in 1894. He was going on his very first voyage on the Cutty Sark to Australia, and this extract is from a letter that he wrote home to his mother describing the realities of life at sea, and it's read by Simon Kane.
15th of July, 1894. My dear mother, I've not commenced keeping a log or diary yet, so I'm going to write a sort of weekly letter to tell you all about the ship and how I get on. We start work at 5:30 in the morning, but that is every other morning, of course, because the other watch will be on deck from 4 to 8 the next morning. The dog watches from 4 to 6 and 6 till 8 at night are so that we should not get the same watch on deck at the same time, and we knock off work at 4 one day and 6 the next. In our watch on deck at night, we have to keep time and ring the bells. The old man has got 3 dogs, Scotch collies, and when we go down in the cabin to see the time, they go for us, which makes it rather thick. If we go to sleep in our watch on deck, they make us ride the grey mare that is up on the upper topsail yard for the rest of the watch. I've not had to do this yet, but the other fella has, twice. And now I must tell you about the grub. We get coffee at 5 o'clock every other morning, coffee for breakfast and tea for tea. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, pea soup and pork. Tuesday, Thursday, salt tram horse and bread. Saturday, junk and spuds, potatoes. Sunday, loo pie. Sugar and butter, we get 4 ounces every week. We get a pannikin of lime juice every day at 12 o'clock. Loo pie is my favourite dinner. It's cooked all together in a great kid, fresh meat and spuds all in a soup underneath and dough on the top. Oh Lord, I could eat 3 whacks of it now. Of course, we get any amount of dog biscuit, and we shall finish the last piece of cake today for tea. We've kept it 3 weeks, which I think is a long time. Our first job at 5:30 in the morning is to wash the pigs and closets out. I always heard that pigs were unclean animals, but now I know it, for a positive fact. and can prove it too. It is a hard life, but you need not think that I do not like it, for I'm enjoying myself very much. Last week I had to go to the wheel and learn to steer. I learned in one dog watch. I must put a round turn on now. I'm always thinking of you all at home, and I know I shall be jolly glad to get back and see you all again.
I love that extract because it's so sort of, there's this wide-eyed enthusiasm for how exotic it all is, and he's so excited by the food and the dog watchers and all this stuff, and it's like a little puppy going, oh, it's so cool, it's so cool. And I guess we sort of forget now that, you know, in 1894 people didn't travel that much, that far, and to be going to Australia was, you know, perhaps not quite the equivalent of an astronaut, but you were going into an alien world. Louise, you chose this extract. What stands out for you from it?
So many things. I mean, this, sadly, we don't have a wealth of first-hand sources that tell us about the experience of being on board Cutty Sark. We do have captain's logs, we do have some letters, and the odd sort of diary account. But really, these letters reveal so much about the day-to-day life, because it's those things that are often missing from the picture. We sort of know about how the ship was built, we know where the ship went, what the ship carried, and so on. But that day-to-day experience is almost sort of missing sometimes. So Clarence Ray really fills in some of those gaps, which is just absolutely invaluable for us. And like you say, he really conveys some of that excitement. I loved his sort of obsession about the food and his resentment about having to clean out the pigs. And when you bear in mind that he's just 16 years old and a typical voyage for Cutty Sark would last sort of 10 months, it's a long time to be away from home. So there's so many things in that letter which start to conjure up a picture for me, and I think hopefully for everyone else, about what life was like on board Cutty Sark.
And just explain for us very briefly what a dog watch is.
Well, the crew would work on a watch system, which would basically be 4 hours on, 4 hours off, and the dog watches were shorter shifts of just 2 hours that would be in the evening, and that meant that the watches could be rotated so that you wouldn't always be doing the same watches. And in fact, it tended to be in the dog watches that apprentices like Clarence Ray would learn new skills. So apprentices were taken on board, they weren't paid anything, they signed up for a 4-year contract. And the idea was that they would learn the skills that they would need to build a career at sea, and in return they would get their food on board. But it tended to only really be in those dog watches when they were taught those new skills, and Clarence Ray does indeed mention having a turn actually steering the ship during one of those dog watches.
And I can see a dog watch being important because obviously there's going to be a rubbish shift, and if the same people always get the rubbish shift, you're going to build up resentment, and it kind of shares that out. And Laura, how about you? What stands out for you from that?
I think it's really charming, and one of the things that's really kind of relatable is the obsession with food and the importance of food and good food. And I think sometimes with ships, we think of the horrible kind of ship's biscuits, and we assume that actually food would have been pretty horrid. But we know that actually food is really, really important. It was really important for morale, and that's something that's continuing right to today. When you talk to crew, the food that they're giving on board, and even the reputation of different companies as to the kind of standard of food is really important. And you'll hear people say that like the chef is the most important job on the ship, because they're the person that keeps people happy, including having celebrations for kind of national days and Christmas and things like Chinese New Year, to kind of uncrossing the line, so to keep those kinds of happiness levels around the crew and that sense of community. I know, Helen, from kind of your expeditions, that's perhaps something that you can relate to too.
Yeah, and the other thing I liked about that menu was that things happen on specific days, and to a landlubber it's like, oh, it's really boring if on Thursday you always get the same thing. But actually when you're at sea, oh, it's Thursday, it's the day when on the Swedish ships now you have pea soup and pancakes on Thursdays, which is a general Swedish thing, and they do it on the ships, and everyone knows it's at lunchtime on Thursdays you get pea soup and pancakes, and everyone's excited because it's pea soup and pancakes day. And it's important actually, that routine to the menu, just because it helps you measure time passing, and it's a thing to look forward to every week. You can look forward to pea soup and pancakes, or in his case loo pie, which was clearly the treat day. So yeah, food plays a lot of roles.
And I think at the moment in lockdown, a lot of people have kind of adopted that habit. So perhaps at the weekend you have kind of slightly more exciting or interesting food to kind of mark the end of another week.
Yeah, there definitely was one.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's get stuck into today's topic. So we are talking about the Cutty Sark, and let's start from the people who have never met the Cutty Sark, Louise. So just give us the brief version of what it is and why the museum has it.
Cutty Sark was built in 1869 in Scotland exclusively for the China tea trade. In the 1860s, about 30,000 tonnes of tea was being imported into Britain each year. And so the owner of Cutty Sark really wanted a slice of that market. Now, at the time, there was also a trend for the freshest tea back in the UK. I mean, it's a bit of a fallacy, really, of course, because tea is a dry product, but there was a real fashion for having the first tea that arrived back in the UK. So that meant that the tea trade was an incredibly competitive one that was revolved around speed. Speed was absolutely of the essence. If you could be the first ship out to China and then back to London, you could command the highest prices and forge a fantastic reputation for yourselves. So that's where clipper ships came in to play. Clipper ships are all about speed. Their design is all about speed. The term, we believe, comes from the phrase "to go at a clip," and they were the ships that were pioneered in the US at the beginning of the 19th century. And clipper ships have three main design characteristics. Now, those are a long, narrow hull, so that's the body of the ship, a sharp, extended bow at the front of the ship, which would cut through the waves rather than bouncing on top, and three raking masts, which support an absolutely huge sail area. So you're really utilising the very best of the wind at hand. And Cutty Sark was actually known as an extreme clipper, so it had all of these qualities in abundance. So Cutty Sark was kind of the pinnacle of the design of an already revolutionary design, and actually clipper ships didn't last for very long. And to try and sort of briefly summarise why the ship is actually now as part of Royal Museums Greenwich, it's because she's a survivor, basically. I think that's what it really comes down to. Cutty Sark is the very last tea clipper on the globe. Clippers like Cutty Sark were built to last for just 30 years, and yet here Cutty Sark is over 150 years later.
So it is a spectacular ship, and there's something very special about seeing the sails of a ship, seeing the masts. I guess it hasn't got sails, but the scale of the masts, when you talk about the power, we're thinking about how to power a ship, and we're used now to the idea of engines, but the sail, you were capturing. The more you could capture, the further and faster it was going to push you. And it's really the idea of putting up this, it's just an enormous structure, isn't it? It's like such a delicate thing in a way, and yet it has to be so robust to shove this ship along. When visitors come to the ship, what do they notice? What sort of reactions do you get?
I think a lot of people remark on the beauty of the ship. And obviously the beauty of the ship had no real impact on how fast it could go. Clipper ships were generally designed to be very attractive ships. The designer of Cutty Sark, Hercules Linton, was heavily influenced by the design of yachts. So he brought that into the design of Cutty Sark, and that's partly why the ship is so attractive. But it's a strange double-edged sword, because I think that some of our visitors actually think that the ship is a replica because she is so beautifully presented. There is almost this feeling that she can't possibly be real, but in fact it's always a surprise for our visitors to learn that 90% of the structure of the ship is actually original to 1869.
And one common reaction that I've certainly heard is that people say, oh, but didn't it burn down?
Yes.
And it sort of didn't, but it mostly didn't. So tell us a little bit about that.
Absolutely, that's right. Yes, of course. So in 2007, there was a huge fire on board Cutty Sark, and it was an absolute catastrophe. It happened while the ship was being refurbished. The ship was closed to the public so that the original fabric of the ship could be preserved for the future. And the way that the team at the time decided to do that was actually to strip the ship of its original fabric, and it was sent down to Chatham for treatment. Fortunately, when the fire struck, that process had already occurred. So actually when the fire happened, although it was devastating and it went through, ripped through all 3 decks of the ship, made the project take twice as long and cost twice as much, in terms of destruction of original fabric, it was nowhere near as bad as it could have been. And actually it's a bit of a theme in Cutty Sark's life, actually, that she survives against the odds, and she has these sort of moments, these instances of luck where she just makes a kind of lucky escape. And interestingly as well, another theme in Cutty Sark's life, related to her sort of survival against the odds, is that it was all down to the reputation that Cutty Sark was able to forge during her career as one of the fastest and most attractive ships afloat, this graceful greyhound, if you will. And because of that, when she has been met with severe adversity, like in 2007, it's actually been public support that saved the ship, and that's happened on 3 occasions in her career.
And one of the things that is most spectacular, I mean, there are many things to love about this ship, but when they did that restoration, they lifted her up out of dry dock, and you can actually walk underneath. And I love that, because I can imagine being in the ocean, looking up as the ship goes overhead. Just tell us a little bit about what the places you can go on the ship, that, you know, underneath, for example, and what you see up above you when you get there.
It's fantastic. I mean, it's a really, really unique thing to be able to walk beneath the ship. And if you're tall enough, you can just about maybe jump up and actually touch the hull of the ship. I'm not tall enough, sadly. But it really emphasises the lines of the ship. When you actually go down to the dry dock and you look at the ship, you can really see these sort of aerodynamic lines that help the ship to be as fast as possible. You'll also see the fact that the ship is covered in a sort of golden material. Now, this at the time of Cutty Sark's career was a material called muntz, which is a copper alloy. And that material was there to protect the ship from things like barnacles. So again, this was all about speed. So if barnacles were to attach to the hull of the ship, it would slow the ship down, it would cause traction. It would also mean that the ship would need to be surveyed more regularly and the hull of the ship treated. So by having this golden hull, it not only does it look pretty spectacular, it's another reason why Cutty Sark was able to go quite so fast. And interestingly, actually, some of our visitors can see there's little bits of white coming through into this golden material, and that's actually salt coming out of the wood from her days at sail. So salt is still coming out from the 19th century to this day.
Well, she is a fabulous way to meet Royal Museums Greenwich, I guess, as you come off the Thames clippers, which are not the same kind of clipper, very sadly. It'd be more fun if they were. But if you get off the jetty there, that's the first thing you see. So let's move on. Now, we tend to think that sailing ships carrying cargo are a thing of the past, but there are some enthusiasts who are trading by sail even today. And Laura went down to the docks to meet some of them in person.
Sark Cargo is about sort of like us recreating the supply system, really, using old technology that still works fantastically well, and that doesn't cause any pollution and doesn't cause carbon emissions. So it's like an inspiration, a way of showing how we can move into the future and have a different way of transport and distribution, which gets us to net zero carbon.
Sail cargo is just about bringing cargo like a normal cargo ship by sailing, and the idea too is to bring product with fair development. It's a product from biological, if it's possible. It's fair trade.
Gavin's had a real sort of big adventure, so it would have started this voyage, this journey back before Christmas. Went to the Caribbean, went to Colombia, and picked up vanilla, raw sugar, and coffee, chocolate beans. Came back to Europe, went to Cornwall. Most recently, it's been down to Portugal. It's collected olive oil, olives, honey. And then to France to collect some salt from the west coast of France. Before coming on to here.
Is it quite an adventure?
It's a big adventure, isn't it? Yeah.
So Laura, it's so amazing to see that people are still doing these things. Just tell me a little bit more about sail cargo. What's the how many ships are there doing this kind of thing now?
So at the moment, there's a fairly small number of ships doing this, and lots of them it acts as a cooperative. So one of the reasons why the Galleon is in London is that it's part of a partnership with the Raybell cooperative, and their ship, the Raybell, is actually currently under restoration. So the Raybell's a Thames barge from about the 1920s. So generally, there's a group of people that all kind of work together, rather than kind of individuals. So the cargo will move between different ships, and also there's a fairly small number of crew or experts that are actually able to look after the ships. There are some plans, because at the moment the ships that they're using are kind of restored historical ships, and there are plans to look at actually whether or not it would be possible to build new ships that would be utilizing some new technology along with these kind of old techniques.
Well, it'd be really interesting to see where they're going. I think it is one of those. I think it's going to creep up on us, because it's one of those where someone's going to build one and it's going to work in one situation, and everyone else is going to go, "Oh, we can do that."
Yeah.
And there's a lot more focus on it now, which is brilliant.
But just when Louise was talking about kind of the shape of the Cutty Sark being really, really important, this is another way that shipping can begin to look at how they can be more kind of eco-friendly or more fuel efficient, because whereas if you see the Cutty Sark and the underneath of it is this really kind of efficient shape, because wind power is limited, it's making sure that it's using every piece of energy that it possibly can to propel itself. Whereas now the fuel that we use in shipping, it's one of the cheapest fuels in the world. So therefore ships like container ships, if you see them, they do look like kind of
boxes, aren't they?
Yeah. And they're really, really inefficient. If you imagine kind of pushing a brick through the water versus the kind of nice shape of the Cutty Sark, you're having to use a lot more energy. But because the fuel's so cheap, it doesn't really matter. Just like Louise was saying, the kind of materials that the hull was made of also made sure that you weren't getting the kind of barnacles growing. We now in shipping use a lot of kind of artificial paint, but they're even beginning to look at if you can almost use like micro bubbles. Yes. To kind of help the fuel efficiency. So as well as kind of in decreasing the amount of kind of carbon that's being used in shipping, it's really, really important, because unfortunately, although shipping's hugely efficient and it is still better than putting something onto a plane or a lorry, it's having a huge impact on human health. So pre the new sulfur rules in 2020, it was estimated that around 400,000 people per year worldwide are dying prematurely just due to the high levels of sulfur in shipping fuel. Under the new rules, that's going to be decreased by about 30%, but it's still having a really huge impact on global health. So it's really, really important that as consumers, but also the wider industry, really pay attention to how kind of fuel inefficient and polluting shipping and kind of general logistics have become.
Well, I would love to see a cargo ship designed by those people who make, the catamarans for the America's Cup, whatever it is, those things that hydroplane on, barely touching the water. I would love to see a cargo ship designed by those people, just out of curiosity, really. The cargo, it might not be the most efficient way to carry cargo, but it would definitely be interesting. So if you just joined us or recently joined us, this is Ships, Sea and the Stars, the weekly online broadcast from Royal Museums Greenwich. And this week we are discussing the Cutty Sark, Royal Museums Greenwich tea clipper, very own full-scale, proper old-fashioned tea clipper, with curators Laura Boone and Louise McFarlane. So we're going to move on now. We heard at the beginning of this episode the point of view of one of the lowest in the ranks on board, an apprentice, and we're now going to hear from one of its captains. So we've got an extract here which is from the diaries of Captain Richard Woodjet, who was the master of Cutty Sark for 10 years between 1885 and 1895, and he was the captain of this ship during its record-breaking voyages. So this is an extract from one of his logbooks in 1891, and it's read by Simon Kane.
An immense sea rolled up right aft. When I looked at it, towering up so steep, in fact, like a cliff, it looked as if it was about to drop over our stern and completely bury the ship. Her stern rose without much water being pooped, but as it rolled along to the main rigging, it dropped on board both sides with tremendous force. Smashing in the door of the fore and after houses, it rushed aft, covering the poop. The water was up to my waist while I was hanging on the rail. You could see nothing but the boats and the masts. The whole ship was completely submerged, great quantity of water rushing down into the cabins, stern rooms, etc. During the 31 years that I have been sailing the seas, I never saw anything approaching it in size and steepness.
So, Louise, we really have a picture of what the ocean can throw at you there. How was this something that, I mean, he said it was the largest he'd ever seen, but did the Cutty Sark regularly get battered like this, or was it a real threat when those kind of waves came along?
That was a real threat. I mean, obviously, every voyage you would encounter pretty difficult conditions, whether it be high winds or high seas, or even extreme heat or extreme cold. But this, I mean, the fact that Woodgett mentions that this is the scariest thing basically he's seen in the 31-year career, I think really paints a picture of quite how extreme this was and how close they were to possibly losing the ship. In a later account, he told an author about this episode, and he described how the ship was basically riding down the wave at a 45-degree angle, which is just a terrifying prospect, and puts me off the idea of sailing a little bit.
Well, I guess it's one of those things that if your ship isn't very maneuverable, it's very difficult. So what you would do in big storms in any ship, certainly do it in a modern ship, is you point the bow into the wind. And I guess if you've got sails and a rudder and I guess you've taken all the sails down at that point because you don't want to get pushed around, your rudder then doesn't really work. And so actually you're very much, going down the front face of a wave at 45 degrees is almost exactly what you don't want to be doing. It would be worse to be beam on, just. But you're not really in control, and the bravery. I mean, it does. Going to sea, we see as this sort of romantic thing that you'd go and you'd visit these exotic places, but it wasn't without risk, was it?
Without absolutely huge risk. And Captain Woodgett in particular, I mean, one of the reasons why he was so successful, he served, as you said, on Cutty Sark for 10 years, and he was the longest serving master on Cutty Sark. And one of the reasons he was able to bring the very best out of the ship in the Australian wool trade is that he was willing to take risks that perhaps his competitors weren't. So what he would tend to do on the way back from Australia, because at this time the ship was in the Australian wool trade, was he would take the ship near to the Antarctic, basically around the tip of South America before entering the Pacific. And he would take the ship really far south so that he could utilise the fastest trade winds in the world. The risk of doing that, however, was that you ran the risk of encountering icebergs, and indeed they did on a number of occasions. In fact, Captain Woodgett himself took a number of photographs of icebergs. So it's it's a risky business, basically. It's really quite a terrifying thing to be part of, and you had to be willing to take a sort of calculated risk if you were to get the very best out of the ship.
And how did this fit with because obviously this is simultaneous at the same time, the Industrial Revolution is going on, factories are coming along, life on land, perhaps is a little bit, I don't know if it's easier, but it's more regulated in some ways. You can go to perhaps a factory job where you couldn't before, things are structured differently. Does it change the way people saw going to sea? Because, previously it had been the great adventure, and then suddenly, I don't know, things at home had changed. Did that change the attitude of the crew? Did it make it easier or harder to recruit?
I think it did. I think it possibly made it harder to recruit. It also meant that there were numerous regulations that meant that the captains had to take better care of their crew. Obviously, in comparison to today, it'd be nothing like the care that we thankfully receive today. But they were under greater and greater obligation. When Cutty Sark was first launched on her maiden voyage, her first 2 voyages, half of the crew would actually sleep in the forecastle. So the Cutty Sark has 3 decks. It's the lower deck and the tween deck, which are below water effectively. And for those first 2 voyages, half of the crew would sleep in the very front of the middle deck. Now, if you imagine,
which is uncomfortable, really uncomfortable.
Incredibly, absolutely. And it meant you're really exposed to all of those elements because you're right at the front of the ship and you're going to be rocking about all over the place. And it also meant, because there's only a single file ladder to get back up onto the main deck, that if an all hands call went out, which meant that all of the crew were needed on board, it would take quite a while because they'd all be on single file going up the ladder. So they took the decision, the owner and the master, to build a second deck house on the main deck. And I think a large reason for doing that was because they were listening to their crew. They had to listen to and think about the welfare of their crew, which is perhaps something that they didn't have to worry about too much in the years previously.
And just tell us very briefly about, because originally, when she was winning these, speed records, this was a prestigious job to have. Even if you had to go through all these awful things, you came back with this badge that says you were part of the crew on the Cutty Sark. And yet it was only a few years later that she sort of slid into decline. So just tell us very briefly about why that happened.
Well, Cutty Sark, I mean, we mentioned earlier about her sort of luck and her survival. I think perhaps her instance of worse luck was that just 5 days before Cutty Sark was launched, the Suez Canal was opened. Now, the Suez Canal cut the voyage out to China by over 3,000 miles. But it wasn't viable for sailing ships like Cutty Sark because there are expensive tolls on the canal itself and the very difficult conditions of sailing through the Mediterranean. So when Cutty Sark set out in 1870, there were nearly 60 other sailing ships like her going out to China and back. Just 7 years later, there were only 9. So the impact of the Suez Canal was felt pretty instantly, and it meant that steamships were able to actually begin to dominate. So Cutty Sark was forced out of the tea trade. She was built exclusively for the tea trade, as we said earlier, but actually only spent 7 years in that trade and was forced to find other means of making money. And I think really it's a testament to the ship's adaptability that she actually managed to last. She did a few years of what's known as tramping, taking whatever cargo she could find from port to port, before she settled in the Australian wool trade. And it's in the Australian wool trade that Cutty Sark really forged her reputation as one of the fastest ships afloat. It's in that trade, rather than the tea trade, that she actually began to break records. And as I touched upon earlier, this sort of allowed Cutty Sark to develop this iconic status, I think. So when she was sold off to the Portuguese in 1895, her owner, John Jock Willis, felt there was no need for the ship anymore, and he was approaching his own retirement. The interest in Cutty Sark remained. So in 1922, when the ship was called into Falmouth, having been damaged, still under Portuguese ownership, she was noticed by retired sea captain, Captain Wilfred Dowman, who vowed to bring the ship back to Britain. So as I touched on before, it's this reputation that goes with Cutty Sark that actually ensures that she actually survived these instances of adversity and has ensured her longevity through the ages.
It's an astonishing story. Well, let's go back to cargoes that ships carry. We've been hearing about how they change in time, and of course, what the ships are carrying does say quite a lot about the societies on either end of that exchange. And Laura has an object for us, an example of some cargo. Laura, show us what you've got.
Of course. So at the moment, all of us curators are quite anxious to get back to our archives, but we've spared no expense in having a special prop with us here today. Now, if we were Georgians, this would blow our minds. I would currently be kind of the highest status person, or even kind of royalty at the very beginning of the period. So be prepared to be amazed. We have the pineapple. Now, which
are awesome. Everyone loves pineapples.
Everyone loves pineapples. They've made a little bit of a comeback. You can now get them printed on all sorts of things. But we do consider these fairly everyday. You'll find them in every supermarket. They've gone down to costing as little as £1. So maybe we don't see them as that exciting. But just like tea and the Cutty Sark tea was really, really important. It was a little bit of a status symbol. So was the pineapple. And we're not sure when it first came to England. There's a portrait of King Charles with one in the 1680s, but it's considered that this probably was one that wasn't grown here in the UK. So it's kind of the first beginning of kind of fake news, where he was trying to show how important he was with a king and claiming that they'd managed to cultivate a pineapple here in the UK. Pineapples don't travel that well. So to begin with, people were spending huge sums of money in growing kind of pineries, so like an orangery, but where you grow your pineapple. And people were building these kind of huge buildings. They were having to be heated at first by coal. So you're spending huge amounts of money, and one pineapple might be costing you around £1,000 at the time when a family was maybe earning like £60 a year. And
so that's a lot of money
it's
for
a lot
one
of money.
piece
It's quite
of
an
fruit.
investment. And there's also really charming stories of people carrying them around a little bit like a handbag. I mean, these are the kind of Birkin bags of their day.
Brilliant. And you've got a very expensive snack if you get home.
Yeah, I mean, later when I go for my walk in the park, I'm kind of tempted to take this out and start that trade.
Well, we should perhaps just say at this point that if someone is listening and you haven't seen how pineapples grow, it is the most extraordinary thing. One of the, Laura was talking about where they come from. They're these little plants. They're low to the ground. They've got sort of these long leaves that spray out, and there's a little pink flower that pops up in the middle, and then this pink flower basically grows into a pineapple, and it's sort of parked on top of the plant in the most bizarre way. If you were going to invent a ridiculous fruit on a plant, just go and look them up after this webcast. They are brilliant. So they are genuinely exotic. That's the other thing about them, isn't it?
Definitely. They're very strange.
So how did people sort of I guess if everyone couldn't have a pineapple, did they put them on things? Did this become a motif that was used?
So you could actually hire a pineapple. So that's how much of a status symbol they were. To start with, royalty were using them at dinner parties to show how important they were, even to other royalty. So when kind of between European royalties, to be like, I'm really important, I can eat a pineapple in front of you. But because the trend started to go, aristocracy were able to grow their own. But for the kind of rich merchant and middle classes, they would hire a pineapple. And so the same pineapple would be passed from kind of dinner party to dinner party. And there was kind of...
So everyone could smell it, basically. They could all smell it,
so you could kind of see it. And then obviously pineapples aren't that long lasting. So when it started to get a little bit past its prime and it could no longer be like on display, it would then be sold to kind of the very rich, and they would then serve it to their guests as another status symbol. So it definitely wasn't wasted, but it is quite bizarre, like this idea of it being passed around. People were also investing in kind of special furniture to best display their pineapple. You can have a Google, there's still things that turn up in auctions, but we also start to see it in architecture, and it was used as a symbol of kind of hospitality. So you start to see it in kind of in the kind of plastering in buildings, railings. So it really, and you also, just like we've more recently seen, you'd see it in kind of clothing. You get like Georgian pineapple earrings.
I have a pineapple necklace, actually. I should have worn it. I should have thought about this.
Well, because pineapples did actually make a bit of a comeback as the kind of motif of the moment in about 2017, 2018. You still get a lot. I had a look around my house, and I'm obviously behind the times because all I could find was a sock with some pineapples on it. But yeah, so pineapples had a little bit of a renaissance, perhaps because of kind of.
So when did they become cheap then? What is it? Was it just trade became easier, or was there something specific that made a pineapple cheap?
So just like the Cutty Sark and the tea trade, steamships were actually its undoing, and because suddenly you were actually able to bring pineapples quite quickly and quite cheaply back, so you didn't have the need to grow them here in England. So actually poorer people began to be able to eat them, and kind of at the same time that the Cutty Sark was bringing back its first tea, is when pineapples began to become much, much cheaper, and they weren't really a status symbol anymore. As with any status symbol, if the masses can afford it, it's you don't really want it anymore. What I found great would anyone like to guess what replaced the pineapple as the status symbol? It is a food item. I was very surprised.
Louise, you going to have a go?
You were surprised, Laura. I'm taking
I was
that
really surprised because it often polls as a very unpopular thing to eat.
I assume it wasn't Marmite.
Sprouts.
Sprouts. Kind of close.
Go on then, tell us.
So the celery.
Really?
Yeah. So in the Victorian era, it was really, really tricky to grow celery. So it was very expensive.
Where does celery come from if it's not? I mean,
you can grow it in the UK. So you'd get it growing in places like East Anglia. but it's just quite tricky to grow. And you'd actually buy special vases to display your celery. You'd have it kind of in the center of the table, and then there's like quite a lot of exotic recipes of how you might cook your celery. But yeah,
so if you fancy pretending to be a posh person, you can now have celery and pineapple for dinner.
Yeah, I have got celery in the fridge, so I did consider trying to make an arrangement, but I thought it was a step too far.
That's brilliant. And we should also say on a serious note here that, as with a lot of these trades, especially early on, people were not always treated well. Just tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, it's really important to remember with a lot of these trades, so things like sugar, pineapples, lots of them, people were either buying them with the profits that they were making either directly or indirectly from the slave trade, the trade of enslaved people, or they themselves, the pineapples were being grown by enslaved people. It's a little bit different with the symbolism of pineapples in the US, because there's even some suggestions that slave traders, when they came back to their kind of grand houses, would actually put a pineapple outside as a symbol that they had returned, and to tell people that they were back and they had goods to trade or even people to trade. So in the US, the kind of symbol of pineapples is a little bit different, but in the UK we definitely know that some people would have been benefiting financially, and that would enable them to kind of be spending such obscene amounts of money.
Yeah, the focus is on
like
the well-known high-value goods like sugar and coffee, but of course lots of things were traded and they all had the same problems. Many of them had the same problems. So just very quickly, you have a bonus object. Tell us about that. It's a badge.
Yes. So I had great fun just looking through all of the museum's archives and seeing what we had on pineapples. It's surprisingly vast. But we do have the badge of HMS Jamaica. This is one of the newer pineapple objects, coming from 1940 when the ship was launched. Now, confusingly for its name, it doesn't come from Jamaica. The ship was built here in England. But it's really important to remember in 1940, so around the same time as Dunkirk, often in the history books we hear of kind of Britain being alone. Its allies in Europe have fallen, but actually it was getting a huge amount of support from all over its empire, including the Caribbean. So at this point, there's approximately 100,000 people from the Caribbean that have volunteered, lots of them leaving their homeland. And it's quite striking that the motto in Latin is talking about kind of not for oneself, but for one's fatherland. And this was very much the kind of mindset of lots of people that were banding together. So as a museum, when we look at our objects, it's really important to remember all the different people and to kind of hear those voices. And especially with the Merchant Navy, which during the beginning of the Second World War was the most dangerous job you could have. Around a third of all Merchant Navy seamen died. You have to remember that was an extremely international crew, and they were working together to make sure that they were supplying the UK here with goods.
So yeah, well, yes, I'm glad you brought that up, and I'm glad the museum is, I think, learning more and more how to highlight these things, and it is really important. Okay, we are almost out of time, but just to round up, I have a question for both of you. To bring it all back to the Cutty Sark and the great sailing ships of the past and possibly the future. So the question is, if each of you could go on one sailing trip, Louise, yours is in the past, Laura, yours is in the future, what trip would you pick? Louise, you can go first.
Well, I'm going to stick with Cutty Sark, and I think it would have to be the Cutty Sark's Hell Ship voyage. Now, this happened between 1880 and 1882, so it's a very long voyage. On that voyage, 7 men died. One became a fugitive of the law, and it was an all-round pretty disastrous trip. So it wouldn't be an enjoyable journey, but there's so much drama and so much mystery around this voyage and so many pictures to paint about the struggles of life at sea, that I can't resist but choose the Hell Ship voyage. And also, during that voyage, the ship was quarantined for 3 weeks because of an outbreak of Asiatic cholera. So during lockdown, that feels somewhat appropriate.
Well, that is a good dedication to the historical cause, I would say. Laura, what trip are you going on?
I think I'd definitely like to join one of the Sail Cargo Network's voyages, especially if it's the bit that goes through the Caribbean, although even Portugal would be nice. So yeah, that's definitely something I'll be trying to add to my future plans for work.
You're prepared to put in the hard work of climbing the rigging and all that kind of thing, scrubbing decks. Good on you. All right, brilliant. Well, we have to finish there for today. We'll be back with more museum objects and stories of sea, space, history and creativity next week. If you'd like to be notified of that, like us on Facebook, like us anyway, but subscribe to us on Facebook or YouTube and you'll be notified whenever there's a new episode coming out. As I said at the start, if there's a question or a topic you'd like us to address, please do get in touch. Facebook, Instagram or Twitter, search for Royal Museums Greenwich. And just as a reminder, very excitingly, the museum is starting to open again. So Cutty Sark on the 20th of July, you can buy tickets in advance. It has to be a little bit more organised. You need a bit more planning perhaps than before. But please do book your tickets in advance if you're nearby. You can go to rmg.co.uk/welcomeback, which is a great webpage, to find out everything you need to know about planning a visit. So these episodes are going to carry on, but the physical site is opening its doors as well. And it only remains for me to say thank you to our fabulous curators, Laura Boone and Louise McFarlane. Thank you to Simon Kane for the readings, to Steve Thompson for the music. James Gill was the producer, and I'm Helen Czerski, and we will see you next week.